Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Gladwell, for the kind introduction.
You wanted to... Okay. Okay, this can... From which media house may I ask? KTN. Welcome, KTN.
Is it ready?
So hope you be with us when we do this again on a bigger scale.
Okay, thanks, Gladwell, for the kind introduction, and thank you very much, Mwalimu, for putting together the report, which is the substance of our discussion today. Now, I have 10 minutes, so I'll make 5 points very, very quickly. So the first is, I think the report, if you look especially at the title, which is basically Kenya's debt treadmill, and then of course the Chinese portfolio, which is a separate question. But if you look at the question about the debt treadmill, Mwalimu, you've persuaded anybody who comes with an open mind that Kenya is on a debt treadmill. For what reason? If you think about a treadmill, I mean, it means you have to keep running and sometimes faster to stay in the same place. And if you looked at the last 10 years and the list that you've provided to us, it seems as if right now the Republic cannot afford not to borrow anymore just to keep finances where they are, just to maintain, I mean, to prevent the bottom from falling off. The borrowing has to come. And you're now borrowing from people with, I'd say, diverse reputations. That's my word. I mean, reputations of different kinds. You just have to borrow from everybody to keep everything running. And that's basically not only just on the external affairs part, on the foreign part as well, government has to keep borrowing just to keep everything else. Suggesting to you that there's a breaking point, possibly, but what you're trying to do is just to prevent a collapse by keeping the pace. So you have to run faster to just stay on the block. So the borrowing, whether it's from foreign sources, whether it's from private sources, whichever, government cannot do without any more money to keep the same cycle going on. So I think on the basis of that treadmill, it's an apt metaphor, I mean, analogy, and now obviously useful. The second thing that the report tells you is, let's ask ourselves, you don't go on a treadmill and start to borrow in billions of shillings from everyone unless something went wrong. And fundamentally, in our view at the Institute of Economic Affairs, perhaps some of the panelists would agree, is there's a serious constitutional error, and more specifically Article 211, A and B, which of course talks about how Parliament, which has exclusive rights to procurement of debt in our definition, because that's spending powers and taxation powers. So debt presents today's expenditure, which is future taxation. So both of those, in our view, is still, if you read Chapter 12 of the Constitution, Parliament's authority. And as you've told us about the suckers of borrowing one way or the other, transparency, records that are incomplete, on the whole, suggests that Parliament has not taken seriously its Article 211 and has not read in the most expansive way what the prescriptions of Article 211 intended to be done. So what still happens is basically Parliament blinks whenever the Treasury says, look, it is not necessary for us to disclose this, or whenever it is presented with incomplete records and is unprepared to do the difficult work that is required, in our view, to ensure that the fiscus is properly balanced, which is the responsibility that they have. So they tend to trust the Treasury or the executive too much, and to take the view that because of the constitutional order that preceded what we have, the antecedent, Treasury had a monopoly on economic policy. That new constitution in 2011 gave responsibility under Chapter 12 to Parliament, and Parliament is unwilling to wield it and use it properly. And of course, that culminates in what you see as Article 211 and the deficits there. The third question is on, I think Mwalimu has presented a fantastic, a meticulous assembly of data with lists about who's owed in terms of all external debt, but then obviously the top 10 largest loans to the Chinese. I have 2 points that I'll make. One is a debater's point, which is I am not persuaded that there's a big grand strategy called the debt trap by the Chinese. I just think that what happens is, in 2008, something happened globally, which was, after the great financial crisis, interest rates in certain parts of the world, more specifically in developed and high-income economies, dropped precipitously. I mean, really, really, really low. For that reason, people were searching for yield, investment arm of banks and all that. So private capital then became available. Countries such as Kenya coming to the fore, justifying it for both political and big reasons such as Vision 2030, decided to open up the taps to try and borrow. And the Chinese were there as well. So borrowing became available on cheap terms, and that's why this question about sovereign debt and debt rating as a way of ensuring that private capital would open up to developing countries became. And I think under the guise of that Africa rising narrative, a dangerous narrative that has taken African countries into the rabbit hole, was adopted. So certain conditions globally which nobody had seen were captured, especially by fast-talking people in the Treasury. Started talking about debt rating as if that's some new thing. We started to talk about the standard gauge railway and how infrastructure and the infrastructure gap, all these things, which is new language for things that have always been spoken about. And then therefore a loading of debt happened. And remember, the loading of debt was not only external, it was also domestic. So people just opened up to a glut and to actually gluttony rather, in terms of debt and huge public spending. And you see huge fiscal expansion taking place around 2014. Really, really aggressive fiscal expansion. And anybody who's a sober person, who's ever had to tell a child or to tell any other person, look, we are closing the pantry door, there's no more candy. Anybody who has that level of sense in 2016 knew Kenya was in trouble. I don't think it was necessarily predetermined, or the Chinese, but once that debt appetite was satisfied, it was going to be, even if it wasn't Chinese debt, it was going to come to something else. So that's the first. The second myth is the question about, I think the other thing is, I think, Gladwell, as you spoke, you were much too kinder to the Chinese. So I don't agree that Kenya's debt problem is a Chinese problem. But when you have an appetite for debt, an avarice for debt, for just public spending, and the belief which was captured politically to persuade us that Kenya's development problem is that there's insufficient infrastructure, and therefore if you have shiny, swanky infrastructure, all growth will follow, it becomes very, very easy then to say stuff such as, look, let's borrow as much as we can. We're going to build things from SGR, all manner of things that were supposed to build a Silicon City and all those things that are supposed to be, because development is supposed to be big goods and especially brick and mortar. It's nonsense, but it's persuasive as well. And so then come the Chinese. Now that appetite was not created by them. But the character of Chinese lending, especially through its state banks, meeting an avarice for debt creates that toxic concoction which we are now talking about here, which is they tend to be non-transparent. They don't care what your constitutional obligations are and whether you violate them, which we think, with the respect to the SGR, has been violated again and again. And therefore we have this. So it's a meeting of different. So the political economy of debt contracting in Kenya is something that I don't think some Chinese guy sat somewhere and conspired for, but says, look, if you guys want to hide information from your own citizens, we don't care, provided you pay us. And so that's what we have coming out here. So the overall transparency problem, and the fact that for China transparency is a suggestion, it matched the Kenya treasuries, and in this case actually I don't absolve Parliament, I mean both the executive and Parliament, their appetite and preference. And therefore they captured that to bypass parliamentary scrutiny. And Parliament accepted it. And why do I think Parliament accepted it? In the last 10 years, the debt ceiling, or what we call debt ceiling, which is a suggestion, completely useless as a policy instrument for managing debt, every time the Treasury came before Parliament and sought its expansion, it was done 7 times. So you have to ask yourself, what value is it if there is no controls around that area? So basically, if you think about it in that way, that comes as the issue. So we have a serious transparency problem, And if you look at Article 201 of the Constitution, which states the principles, and the transparency questions are reinforced again and again. Before you talked about intergenerational equity and the prudence that is required. We call them the prudence principles of public finance management. You cannot suggest that they've not been violated again and again. And I think a correction is due. How that happens, whether it's through the courts or whether it's through something very serious happening, is something that we don't wish to, but we don't wish for a crisis to generate it, but I think a discussion such as this lets us to do. And then finally, as I come to the tail end, the transparency problem in Kenya manifests itself in really, really interesting ways. And I think because the parliament, by being persuaded that debt procurement is very technical and beyond their ken, have ceded that responsibility to the Treasury, which then, to the executive, which then tells them when and if. And what then happens is, Mwalimu has told us the 10 largest, or rather has placed on page 17, I think, the 10 largest Chinese loans in Kenya, after taking us through that database of 200. That's meticulous work. That in itself is very difficult. And that's what the Treasury likes. They dump that data because they know by the time you organize it and are able to extract insights, they already got the approvals that they wanted from Parliament, and they're gone. So you're dealing with it into the future. But I think there's something about it that tells us why we need to be committed to a public debt register, whatever we call it, or a database. One, I have sat in a room in which I had, no names mentioned, but I've sat in a room in which I had professionals from the African Development Bank stating that they have not asserted themselves enough such that Kenya's most, singularly successful infrastructure project in 2008 or 9, the Thika highway, super highway. So here is the fact. The fact is, it wasn't funded by the Chinese. The contractor was a Chinese person. But the payer and the person who held the liability, or rather was Kenya's partner, was actually the African Development Bank. But the absence of clarity around these issues makes Kenyans attribute it to the Chinese. So it was a contracting firm. So Mwalimu, we might have to go back there and actually ask what's the truth around this area. Because as I conclude, one of the things I'd like for us to do about public transparency on debt, we should have a single source of truth about who is owed, on what terms, the tenure of the loan, the coupon rate, if there are works and subsidiary arrangements which require for somebody to undertake, all those things should be available, and it should be a public database. A couple of years ago, the IEA played around with well, this is what happens when you get an opportunity to go to New York and you see the public debt clock in New York and for Kenya. And our intention was to place it somewhere close to where all parliamentarians passed, so that as they pass, they can see it every day and recognize that is it. Right? Now, somebody, stole our idea, but they made it a technical one. It's available and it's running somewhere on somebody's X page. But because they didn't think about it, our view is actually to use public data to construct a public debt clock so that we can see, just like we have population clocks, on the minute what the legal obligation is per person. That does not happen until we have a cleaned debt register telling us all the items about what is owed, so that every month or every week or every so often we can issue a report like your bank issues to you on regular terms when you have borrowed. So we have a transparency problem. And of course, Monday morning quarterbacking is necessary. If more transparency had been available, if Parliament had insisted on it, and the rest of us actors had insisted on it, using Article 211 to activate it, perhaps Kenya's debt distress, even if it were to exist, would not be as serious as it is today. And then there's the big question, which Mwalimu left about. The transparency problems that we have with the public debt problem on the external side manifest themselves and are reproduced on the domestic side as well. There's a dark hole there as well. Thank you very much.